Hi, everybody, and welcome into the Continual Panel Room. Today's program is We Never Drink Wine, a discussion of vampires in fiction and film TV. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and we'll start this evening by having our panelists go around and introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they write and what they write specifically about vampires. So, Dacre, if you'll start us off.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for having me. My name is Dacre Stoker. I'm the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. So my research and my writing is focused on what I can find out about Uncle Bram, some of the mysteries and inspirations for his writing of Dracula, and some of his other stories that were obviously some vampire-related, some not. And all that research has brought me to write, to co-author 2 works of nonfiction so far. That's Dracula the Undead with Ian Holt back in 2009. Then I found Bram Stoker's Lost Journal, which I co-edited with the famous Dr. Elizabeth Miller. And then recently Dracula with J.D. Barker, which is a prequel to Dracula. And now I'm working on short stories and some more books. And it's all focused on sort of the universe of Bram Stoker, some of the things that he did not put into his book, because I've had access to his notes and the typescript and other papers and things around the world. So my vision and focus is really around his world. But what's cool is I keep finding cool things that he didn't put in the book, that I have records that he had planned to. And that's what I sort of bring to life. So I'm trying to sort of fill in some of the things that his fans maybe didn't get a chance to read in his novel, Dracula, 1897.
Quinn?
I'm Quinn Yarbro. I've been writing professionally for 54 years. When it comes to vampires, I've got over 33 books now in the Saint Germain cycle and still going. In fact, next month I'll be starting the new one. And then I've also done other vampires, sometimes under other names than my own. And they're interesting. You can play with them a lot. And I also write mysteries. I write science fiction. I write fantasy. I've written kids' books. You name it, I've probably written it.
Elle-Marie?
I am Elle-Marie Wood. I'm a psychological horror author. Every now and then I write about vampires. My second novel, called The Promise Keeper, is a vampire novel based, it starts in Benin and then moves to the Caribbean and then to New York in the 1950s. That novel actually introduced me to this festival that I'd never heard of before called Vamp Fest, or the International Vampire Film and Arts Festival. And I actually won the Golden Stake Award for that novel at that festival. So that was pretty cool. I have a couple short stories that I, just again, as a psychological horror author, I don't typically use a specific antagonist like that. But every now and then I have pulled a vampire into my work, and it's been very interesting when I've done so.
Matthew?
I'm Matthew Saunders. I wrote a trilogy about the origins of the Brides of Dracula, Daughters of Shadow and Blood, which takes place over about 400 or so years of European history, from 1599 to 1999, basically. So that's my, I pulled a lot of real European history into the story. Took a lot of inspiration also from the novel Dracula as well.
Okay. Well, and one thing that I always like to know about writers is why they write what they do. So why vampires? What draws all 4 of you to vampires? Quinn, will you start for us?
Well, I think part of what it is that vampires are creatures of extreme ambiguity. They are and they aren't dead at the same time. That's a neat trick. And they seem not to be bothered by real world considerations that most of us spend most of our lives taking care of. And that too is one of those ambiguous things about them. Why don't they have these problems? Well, that's because they're improperly dead, or they're improperly alive, whichever spin you want to put on it. And I like, since Saint Germain is a good guy, not a bad guy, and he's still a vampire. The hardest thing in that was to work out how much of the vampire myth stories had to be taken as fact for vampires and how many could be discarded. And that was a lot of folklore reading.
Matthew?
Well, I'm such a huge history geek anyway. I love the history, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, that whole area, is fascinating to me. The history there is just as interesting to me as any sort of fantasy world you could come up with. Started there, the folklore of that region as well, which is the sort of the origin of where vampires came from. All those stories. So that kind of started it with me. Dracula is my favorite classical novel. I read it. It's one of the few novels that I actually reread. So I mean that's kind of what started it for me. I love vampires in particular because they're such good they're such good like metaphors for lots of different things, like metaphors for addiction, metaphors for disease, metaphors for corruption. People use them for all kinds of different reasons in films and television shows, movies, things like that. So they're monsters, but they're attractive monsters, especially in the more modern iterations of it. They're seductive and they're charming. And if we're not careful, we can also become them. So that whole idea is something that I, really wanted to kind of explore in my writing.
Elle-Marie?
And Matthew took a little bit of my answer with that, but I will just add in, I mean, they're cool, honestly. I mean, when you think about, put plainly, they're cool. I mean, when you think about, they represent transition. So when you think about that opportunity, you can look at vampires in a different light and not necessarily the frightening, the depictions that we saw early on, especially in film, the brutal, frightening beast, if you will. They can be alluring, they can be sensual, they can, be exciting, and one could, really envision their life in that way. And I think the Twilight series did that quite a bit in terms of that whole love affair and just the romanticism of the whole vampire. But at the same time, it's the point of no return. I mean, you can't then change back and go back to your normal life. And so that sort of danger is enticing. And I think that not only as a reader, but as a writer, you can play with so many different emotions and scenarios because they are so transitional and so, I don't know, they're cool. I go back to cool.
And Dacre?
They are cool. And Dracula is a good book. And that's, it's like if I didn't do vampires, I'd be kicked out of the next family reunion. So there was not much choice. Really, when I came into the game here, it was trying to figure out what Bram Stoker found in his research to create Count Dracula. And that has been really interesting. I'm sure I read some of the same books that Matthew has and some of the others. What I'm actually trying to do is not take the vampire for granted and actually do some writing and research on some of Bram's other characters, because so much is already known about Count Dracula, but how much about the origins of Jonathan Harker and Van Helsing and some of these others. So that's, I'm trying not to take it for granted because it is so cool, but I'm also thinking rounding it out a little bit too. And some of these other guys featured more in my stories as well.
Okay. And I wanted to say, as we go into the discussion, if you want to respond to something that someone else said or pick up on something that someone else says, you don't have to wait for me to chime in. You can go ahead and do that. And so when we look at the different concepts of vampires that are now out there, movies and books and television series, they're all have their own little unique twists. But if you were to take the term vampire and boil it down to what you see as its essence, what would that be, and how does it compare with vampires in your work? And Matthew, you want to start us?
So my vampires are not nice people. They take life. They do not feel remorse about it. Some of them have a code of conduct that they abide by, but it's not a moral code that a person would necessarily adhere to. When I think when I was writing them, I kind of just modeled them on, sort of they are apex predators. They are sort of the ultimate sociopath. Very, very charming, very pleasant on the outside, but on the interior, they do not feel any kind of empathy. They do not feel, connections with other people the way that we would think of them. That's kind of what I was going for when I was writing them. They only take, basically, and that's kind of the essence of the vampire as I was writing it was this creature that does not give, that only takes. And so, that was in my head, I guess, when I was writing them. But, the trick when I was writing the novels was, how do you get some, if I did my job, if you're reading one of my books, if I did my job at various points in long, you're rooting for the vampire. because some of my human characters are worse than the vampires, and so it was fun to kind of play with that, to write a character that is horrible in a lot of ways, that and have the reader connect with it. And I guess that's going back to what I said before, like it's a monster that we can become if we're not careful. And so that was kind of my approach to it.
Okay. Marie?
So I guess, Nancy, when I think about vampires, I think bloodsuckers, but that's just one piece of it. As a psychological horror author, I often am trying to figure out what's going on in someone's head, right? So my vampire is a bloodsucker, but she's completely reluctant. She does not want this life, but she's stuck with it. She's not running around having fun, driving fast, and loving the whole idea of this. She is not interested, but she still has to feed because she's a vampire. So I think that for me, when authors and movie makers and things like that, when we see these sort of representations, when I'm looking for it, I'm looking for that base knowledge, that core of it being the beast being a bloodsucker. Any other attributes that are added on are what I consider creative license. I mean, my vampire is searching for a way out, searching for, a way to solve a problem that's happening in her life and in her family. The vampire piece is part of it. It's, but it's the cause of her issue, but it's not the only focus of my story. But when I'm reading other work or watching a movie, I still want them to have that core issue that they are a vampire, so that when they don't drink blood, it's an issue for me. when I don't see that sort of struggle, even if they're going to be, because some vampires don't struggle, and I'm also okay with that. I like the vampire who's really down with this whole lifestyle. That's okay too. But when they're not interested, I'm curious to see how the blood sucking either becomes a really prominent issue or it slips away and is removed from the equation, because then we're just dealing with a person with a quirk, not a vampire. So when I'm looking for it, when I think of vampire, as your question was, that's what I'm thinking of.
Okay. Dacre?
It would be easy for me to say, I just stick with Bram's Dracula. But, first of all, I recognize that since 1897, to keep vampires, relevant in literature and on stage, on screen, big and small, and everywhere in between, they have evolved and they need to evolve. And that's what I think is absolutely wonderful. They've gone in so many different directions, and they attach human qualities, different looks, different attributes. But when it boils down to it, which is really your question, Nancy, the essence is, this is a creature, this is a monster, a supernatural being that has existed in the consciousness of people for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that means it's different things to different people. But to me as a writer, this is a creature that takes life from the living, and it has very few human qualities, although they can take them on because they are the ultimate predator. And that ultimate predator is able to shapeshift, it is able to survive in under any conditions. And that's why they have lasted so long. But the one other thing I'd like to say is I like the fact that there is still a certain amount of vulnerability in a vampire. There's still certain things that will reduce its effectiveness or actually, kill it or destroy it. They are not, completely immortal, because there are certain things that they can be done in with. And it's mind games. It's also obviously physical things like stakes in the heart and so on. So that's again, I focus on Bram's original and try to go back to the basics like Matthew has described a little bit, but I'm okay. And I certainly do it myself, add, more qualities to them as well, just to keep them relevant and keep those readers guessing what's going to be next.
And Quinn?
How to put it? I think it's the undead state that is also weirdly alive. That's the thing that is basic to all vampires in various ways they've appeared in folklore and literature throughout, many, many thousand years. Improperly dead people are in folklore about 10,000 years ago. And if that, with characteristics that tend to involve having to live off the living in order to keep going. And so, they may be drinking things other than blood. There's a Chinese vampire that drinks spinal fluid, which has always struck me as being just a little bit too esoteric in their appetites, but worked very well for the Chinese. And Dacre and had mentioned, and I think Matthew did too, Elizabeth Miller. And I met her literally in Bucharest at the first World Dracula conference, which was an academic conference. The only writer there was me. And listening to all the various academics explain their various theories and insights and persuasions about what vampires were really all about and what Stoker was up to. Some of it was fascinating, but occasionally I found myself with this mad desire to go up and choke them. And it was a fascinating event because there were people from all over Europe, from Russia, from the United States, and everybody's take on it was different. And there was one paper which was not specifically on Dracula himself, but it was about Van Helsing, and the movie Van Helsing had just come out. And Jim Holt, who was an academic who writes very funny papers, had his paper that year was Why Van Helsing Cannot Swing by a Rope. And it was one of those that had everybody laughing. And it's true, you have these characters that when they're doing something out of character, it bothers you. And you have, as a writer, you better have a very good reason for them to do it. Because if you don't, somebody's going to, send you fan mail you'd rather not receive.
Well,
Nancy, can I quickly just say something to Quinn?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure how many the rest of the fellow panelists have felt this way. Quinn, you said something that really makes me laugh, because I do try to go to some of these academic conferences. I have published one piece of nonfiction with Dr. Miller, she's great because boy, does she ever try to, keep you on the straight and narrow. Some of these guys don't seem to have much fun, Quinn. And when you said, it made you laugh, they don't laugh very much because they take themselves awful seriously.
Yeah.
And when all of us consider what the vampires are, it is folklore. It's misinterpretation of contagious disease. It's all these other things that it is. And yet these folks, and I get great respect for many of them because I follow a lot of their work and I benefit from their work and I share a lot of mine with them. But it's like, hey guys, relax. Just go read a book by any of us on the panel. Go read somebody, Stephen King or Anne Rice or somebody. Just relax and just realize it's all just make believe.
Yes, we made it up. It's called a novel. Therefore, it is fiction, which means it didn't happen.
Yeah, I have to add in there because I'm one of those academics, but I do laugh quite a bit. So I think you all
good.
No surprise, right? I think we know that at this point. But I absolutely, I wrote a paper, and I don't know if you were at this one, but I've given this talk a couple of times about real vampires and their relationship to otherness. And just when the title hit me first, right, and then I'm thinking, that's an awfully serious topic. I don't think I can pull it off. Like I'm never going to make it all the way through this thing. So there's quite a bit of laughing, and even some Right Said Fred is played in the background at some point. So that there's a lot of funny going on, but I can't agree more. Yes, we don't laugh enough.
Well, I was born and grew up in and spent most of my life in Berkeley. So academics do not impress me. The street that I lived on it was 2 blocks long, and we had 3 city planning professors living on it, and they did not like each other one little bit.
Oh my God.
And so that when you would have a party for people on the block, you had to be very careful, which of that group of 3, which one you were going to invite, unless you wanted to have a show of academic footnote comparisons that would drive everybody out the doors.
Well, and actually that kind of leads into one of the other things that I wanted to discuss, because academics love to talk about tropes.
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't hear that word until about 10 years ago. And then I began to realize it's very popular in academic circles. So following up on that, what are some of the common tropes in vampire stories? And which ones do you like personally, just your personal taste? And which ones would you rather see kind of go away because they're overused or not done well? El Marie, you want to start us?
Of course you'd say that. I'm raising my eyebrow going, I don't know which one I think I like so much of it because I think that the one that I think it's overused, especially in movies, is the one where it's like devil may care, so what, now I'm undead, I'm going to just ride the wheels off this thing, and just the movie, it makes no sense, and the vampire you can't connect to the vampire. But this is a thing you keep seeing over and over and over, hence the term trope, right? And I think that while I enjoy it, I'd kind of like it to stop now. I've enjoyed it in the past. But I mean, I kind of like the vampire who, I saw something once, a vampire who was allergic to blood. I'm kidding, that's silly, but it's hilarious. I mean, or the vampire who falls in love with a human and doesn't want to turn the human, and then there's all of this stuff. I kind of like the stuff that people would consider cringy and enough already. I don't know. I think that what I do is I look at the vampire as such a versatile character, such a versatile antagonist, that it can do so many different things and can be anywhere it wants to be. Whether that is riding the motorcycle. I will say this, just like Quinn said, there's got to be a reason for why we're putting the vampires in certain circumstances. I mean, if we're going to walk around in the daylight, just explain it, please. Because that's a trope that we're used to not, we've all agreed, and we all agreed that they don't walk in the sunlight. So tell me why this one does. I mean, just make it clear. Not saying you can't. I think that I'm okay with a lot, but perhaps the motorcycle riding, fast car driving one that's like, just, I don't care. I'm going to pitch myself into a pit and hit the wall, and it's not going to matter.
Quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the one so if I have to pick one, Nancy, that's the one I'm picking.
You can actually pick more than one if y'all want.
The problem is I think I'm okay with a lot. So
Dacre, how about you?
Well, first of all, I got to give a shout out to Emily Gerard, because without Emily Gerard's book, Land Beyond the Forest, and essay, Transylvanian Superstitions, all these things that Bram picked up on, I don't know where he would have found them. And that's a cool thing, because I've been researching that in the last couple of years and just putting together today a presentation for something in a couple of weeks. And it's like everything he pulled out, no reflection in the mirror, money always, old gold, that all bases back to these Transylvanian superstitions that he got from her. So shout out to the Scottish lady, Emily Gerard, who was living in Transylvania at the time. But here's the one that drives me crazy the most. When they shapeshift into a bat or a rat or a dog or something, what the hell happens to their clothes? that I know it's humorous, but you got me going on that, Lisa Marie. Is like, what happens? How do they get back into their nice cape and everything else afterwards? That's kind of somewhat of a trope.
I have problems with them shape-shifting into things that are, an eighth the size of a human being, because what happens to the mass?
Yeah.
If you're going to shape-shift, you better do it to something that's about the same size as you are.
yeah, how about that? Or how do you become mist and then come back to becoming a human? Or
Yeah, that's the hard part. Never mind the clothes. What happens to the rest of the body?
right? Oh, how did you do that? That's like Star Trek kind of stuff. And now we're mixing genres, and I'm kind of okay with it. But explain it.
I mean, I'm sort of answering my own question, but it's so easy. We all do it. Hey, guys, it's the supernatural. Natural laws don't apply here. But still, that rational mind of all of us and most of our readers, I don't know how you guys feel, but I get, at airports and different places, what happens to their clothes? And I don't have an answer. So it's okay. Well, it's supernatural, guys. Just take it easy.
It's true. Well, and I want to add in, if I can. I mean, the Hulk. Let's just go back to it about the clothes. Lou Ferrigno's pants fit him. How?
Yeah.
Just tell me how.
Have you seen Lou lately at conventions? I've seen Lou. He's still looking pretty good.
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
And his pants fit at least at breakfast time before he goes to the photo ops.
Matthew, did you want to add something?
It's interesting. A couple of things. As far as tropey things this is more recent, and this one's always bothered me, and I'm not calling out Twilight here, because Buffy the Vampire Slayer does the same thing with Angel. On this is you've got a 250-year-old vampire going after a teenage girl. And like reliving high school and things like that. I'm like, I think when you hit that age, you probably have sort of, I don't want to go back to high school. So I don't understand why you would want to relive high school over and over again. That's always the one that's one that's bothered me. But Dacre was mentioning with the walk and Marie too, with walking in the sunlight. And things like that. It's interesting because in Dracula goes around and walks around in the daylight. Just his daylight doesn't kill him; it just weakens him and takes away his power. And that's actually something I pulled into my novels, because my vampires travel a lot. And I couldn't, I was like, it was too logistically, it was just too hard to have them not be able to go around during the day. They can manipulate the weather and make it cloudy, so they can make it overcast so there's not direct sunlight. But I couldn't. So I pulled that into my novels from Dracula, but then I had to, because that's such a part of vampire lore as people understand it now, that if you don't explain it, then people get upset.
Mm-hmm. They think if you get it wrong, they challenge you. Well, we all know where it came from. It's Nosferatu, and it's that great scene
exactly
when the Orlok is in front of the window, and boom, And so after that, it's like, well, did Bram Stoker get it wrong? No, the movie came after that. That was just one of his decisions to have, he is a creature of the night, but the day he just has to either put on the sunblock or have a cloud over him, like Matthew said.
You can put on the sunblock. I love that one.
Quinn, did you want to add anything?
Well, actually, talking about all these things that people think are true of vampires, and I put true in quotes. I have one fan I have been known to duck into men's rooms to avoid. She wants to be a vampire. I mean, she really wants to be a vampire. And Saint-Germain walks around in the daylight because he lines his shoes with his native earth. So he's immunized himself against sunlight. So she had a pair of shoes made and has filled the soles with her native earth. And when she gives you her business card, she bites it first, so you'll recognize her bite. And that has gone beyond what I think of as reasonable fandom. That goes into some realm of weirdness that I'm not prepared to deal with.
Look what you've created.
Well, I hope not, because I don't mind the fact that I've got people who enjoy it and they buy all the books when they come out. I think that's wonderful. But I'm not creating a blueprint as a way to go and live your life as a vampire.
We know in the show Moonlight that starred Alex O'Loughlin, I think it ran for 2 seasons. His vampire could go out in the daytime, but he was weaker when he went out. So I guess that goes back to the original.
Well, a lot of the folklore, one of the ways that you can recognize a vampire is they're out at night. And that, back before nice street lighting and everything else, being out at night was a risky thing to be. So people who did it, obviously there was something amiss.
Yeah. And what other creatures, are out at night? Bats, rats, wolves, owls, all these sort of mystical things that could do harm to you, or you think they can do harm to you. So the vampires fall right in. In the daytime, we can see.
The wolves certainly can. So
I did want to add though, that just reminded me of something. If you and Dacre was talking about the shape shifting and the where did our clothes go, the recent Netflix Dracula has a very gruesome scene where Dracula is shifting from a wolf into a human and directly addresses that question of where are the clothes, because there are none.
That brings to mind the that movie Fright Night back in the 80s, the original. Mm-hmm. When he was bitten, the kid, I can't remember his name, but yeah, there were no clothes. He shifted into a wolf and he had no clothes when they killed him. And I thought, okay, then. Like, there we have it. Finally, there we have it.
Well, as I'm sure all of you are aware, vampire fiction was born in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. But it really seems to me, as an outsider looking in, that it took off late in the second half of the 20th century. First, do you think that's an accurate impression? And if not, how would you describe it? And what do you attribute this sudden surge in popularity over time? Quinn, do you want to start us?
Yeah, movies.
Mm-hmm.
Movies, they stopped making little tawdry kinds of shocker films, and they did something that looked like a real movie, and people liked it. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started seeing kids running around with blankets tied around their necks so they look like they had capes, running around and doing their Dracula imitations.
Yep.
And if the kids love them, that there's something in there that is really talking to something that human beings really like.
Yep.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll add to that the sexy, I think. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I think that when Interview with a Vampire came out, the movie, with the cast that it had, I mean, it was take your pick. You've got so many different appealing vampires to look at and listen to for however long the movie is, that I think that it sparked this interest in, oh, well, vampires don't have to be this gruesome Nosferatu thing that I remember seeing when I was a kid. It doesn't have to be the Bela Lugosi thing that with the eyes highlighted, as he spoke to you with a thick accent. Doesn't have to be that. It can be this amazing visual, if you will, and I can enjoy it. So I think that and that's interesting because I had read the book before I saw the movie, and I thought the book was amazing. And I'm just when I saw the movie, I was like, well, of course that's perfect casting. I may be in the minority with that thought across the board, but I definitely thought it was a great casting. And I think that for a lot of people, it became the moment where they said vampires they're accessible. So I'm interested in watching.
And cool.
Yeah,
very cool.
Nancy, let me try to take a stab at this because a good friend of mine who is an academic, John Edgar Browning, who's currently teaching at Savannah College of Art and Design in Atlanta, though, but he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Dracula and Visual Media, and one of the things he touched on was looking at all the visual media going back to obviously stage in the 20s. And he looked at censorship, and he looked at in the 50s and 60s that the vampire movie was one of the few things you could go into and see, a lot of cleavage. So there was the sex sells. Okay, there wasn't as much blood, but then the censorship on other movies relaxed. So the other movies could start showing more skin, and the vampire movies weren't the only thing in town to go and see skin. So they had to up their game, but they were allowed to show more gore. And so by upping their game, we start seeing, Stephen King's and Anne Rice's adaptations, and they're actually pretty darn good movies. It's not just the Dracula smiling at you or, doing the old blah, blah, blah thing. So that caused this uptick in the mid 70s, which I think then caused many people, not just the movie writers and the directors, but writers as well, to sort of catch up and go, okay, this vampire thing, we can start taking it seriously, and let's look into, some interesting plots and so on. So that was a take. I can't take credit for that. I think I've explained it fairly well, what John has told me and what's in his book that I actually wrote the afterword for.
Well, I have friends who say that prior to the release of Star Wars in 1977, outer space action adventure movies were kind of cheesy and not really.
There were some exceptions.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Quinn, what did you say?
I said most of the outer space movies were kind of cheesy, but some of them weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people who knew what they were doing, and believe it or not, actually hired science fiction writers to do the scripts. And guess what? They were better.
What would be one that you would recommend on that?
I forget the title of it, but it's Forbidden Planet. That's the title. And it was based on The Tempest. Which is my dictum that I tell most people: if you're going to write and you need to steal from the best. That's
right. So what those people say is that that Star Wars forced everybody to up their game.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's like what Dacre was saying about the Anne Rice movies and the Stephen King books. It's that forced people to up their game. Was there anything else that you think happened right around that time, or anything else that was produced, book, movie, TV, that kind of also boosted vampire stories?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, I need some help here, but Richard Matheson wrote a lot of the stories. I mean, about the Last Man on Earth, but it was, and it just Omega Man. I mean, that guy spans a number of years, and I think you've got to, I need to shout him out because he won Horror Writers, best vampire novel of the century. And so but I think he also gets credit with longevity because of all the different adaptations of his book. So that probably had something to do with it, but I'm not a great expert on it.
Well, one of the things that that was different about Star Wars is that George Lucas didn't have a studio to answer for. He was answering to his own studio. It meant he could do it his way, and no matter what the other people thought, it was going to be exactly what he had in mind. And that's a luxury very, very few producers actually have.
It's very true. Matthew, did you want to weigh in on any of that?
I was just going to say, I'm putting on my lawyer hat here, being being just slightly bit cynical, but if you look at we mentioned Nosferatu, and there's the very kind of famous story around how it's sort of an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula, and how Bram Stoker's widow sued the production company into oblivion over it, and she won the copyright lawsuit over that movie, had every single copy of that movie destroyed except for I think one that was in some basement in France and Paris somehow that survived, and that's how we have that movie now. But that was kind of a famous case at the time, this copyright case over Dracula, that kind of built up interest over it. But then, shortly after that, it turned out that Bram Stoker never perfected the copyright in the US. So
that's not true, though. I'm sorry. If you would like me to enlighten you, and I'm sorry, but I'm on a quest to right that wrong. And
right, the
Matthew,
wrong. Okay.
I totally agree with what you just said about Nosferatu, but I've got to say this in this panel. I've heard that story for the last 10 years, and my wife and I decided to try to get to the bottom of it. And I think you'll all be enlightened when I can say we contacted the Library of Congress. We actually contacted the person who found out that, yes, there was 2 copies of Dracula, and Bram did everything absolutely right. The problem was that when it was filed as Stoker, Bram in one copy, and Bram Stoker in the other. So there was this misfiling that made it much easier. And I don't know who all the biographers were that have started this, but they made Library of Congress made an honest mistake. And then the biographers made a somewhat honest mistake. But when I finally got to the bottom of it, luckily we found this person who said, this doesn't make sense. And it cited exactly what you said, Matthew, that Bram Stoker's widow did this. But not only that, Bram Stoker was called to the bar in London. He was actually, he could have practiced law if he wanted to. He wrote a whole legal manual while he was an inspector of petty sessions. And that manual was still used through 1960 in Dublin. And he wrote all of his own contracts for his books. So this lady at the Library of Congress thought, there's no way this guy could have made this mistake. And I'm sorry to manipulate this, but we can put this to rest right now. He didn't make the mistake. That's an urban legend. So sorry, carry on.
No, but I mean, it still led to, a lot of the movie versions that happened in the 30s, in the US, because they felt they were free of that, restriction. And then when the copyright did finally expire, I think it was in the early 60s in England.
Yeah.
Because I think the law at the time was life plus 60 years or 50 years, at the time in Great Britain. So when the copyright did finally expire, because that's around the time you said the mid-centuries, when the copyright finally did expire in the early 60s, people had already sort of a interest in it. And all of a sudden these movie studios had, a cheap source of, of material that they could use without having to necessarily pay for it. And so, that also, helps to take off, the interest of it is that, these studios that, could pull in that, material and make these adaptations without having to worry about royalties and things like that.
I'd like to add a little different perspective about, how we're talking about upping the game. So in the 70s, you had, we call them black exploitation or blaxploitation movies, right? But in that same ilk, you had Blackula. So silly name. However, if you've ever watched the movie, the name, it doesn't matter how silly the name is, the movie is actually stellar. Blackula, it starts off with, I don't want to call him a king or a president, I'm not sure, from one of the fictitious African countries, and they come to eat dinner with Dracula, and they get turned during this dinner because there's a scuffle about, Dracula thinking he can be handsy with the wife, and at the time the one who ends up being Blackula is like, you're not doing this, and then all of a sudden they find themselves, the one's in a coffin, and the woman is chained to him. So that's that. But that's the beginning, which is already ingenious. What a great twist. And now you have the Blackula story. From that story, I remember being just a young child and thinking, I'm not watching that. That sounds ridiculous. And then the first time I watched it, I was like, okay, I'm in, right? But that gave, the African-American community notice in the first place, because it's not like we didn't watch Bela Lugosi. Everyone that I've ever seen or known has watched Bela Lugosi at some point in their lives. We all know who that is, but it wasn't scary. It was just kind of something that was on television, not something that was, really impactful. But Blackula is impactful. And that's when you come into the 80s and 90s, when you're dealing with the movie that Eddie Murphy did. What was that? Vampire in Brooklyn. And some of these other renditions that you're finding that they range from the silly to the serious. But it's a when we talk about upping your game, we can talk a little bit more about expanding your game as well, so that vampires mean something different. Because from that point on, I don't know, I don't feel that was it might have been the bug in my ear to write this novel, years later. But every filmmaker that I have a film degree. That's how I started back at Howard, and all of us saw that movie. All of us were interested in doing something similar. So yeah, there's upping, but there's also expanding the game. So,
well, switching gears for a minute, what was the first vampire piece you remember reading or seeing, and how do you think it played into your eventual decision to write about vampires? Quinn, would you like to start us?
I think folklore, the first things that I read that involved vampiric behavior were various folklore tales. I had a next door neighbor at the time when I was a little kid who had been a high school teacher, and she was retired. And so the fact that there was a really curious kid next door, she just had a wealth of folklore material. And that's when I encountered the idea of what vampires do and what they are. And, even though I was like 7 years old, it looked pretty classy to me. And when I first read Dracula, it really took me in. And the second time I read it, I was in high school, and I thought, this story has a lot of good going for it, but there's no reason he has to be the bad guy. Mm-hmm. He confers a kind of provisional immortality through a highly intense and worthwhile sexual experience, which was not that common in Victorian England. Thank you very much. And so, if you got rid of Van Helsing and his group of crazies, you wouldn't have a story, but you could have a vampire who was in fact a good guy. And years later, that's what sort of got me going on Saint-Germain.
And you're up to how many of those now?
33.
Dacre, how about you?
Well, I was about 10, and there was the school was putting on some kind of movie around Halloween time, and it was the Fearless Vampire Killers, and so that was my first exposure, and it was like, wow. But I was really taken aback at the beginning when it said, something to do with, based on, or something to do with Bram Stoker's Dracula. And of course, all my schoolmates just took great thrill in giving me all kinds of crap for that, throwing things at me and everything else. And I really had no idea what really the impact of what my great granduncle had actually done to even influence, a movie like that. But probably the most impactful was Salem's Lot. I was brought up and raised in Montreal, and for us to go to Maine in the summertime was a big deal. Some friends of ours had homes in these cool little towns in Maine. And when I read that book, it was on one of those summer week holidays in Maine, and my God, I felt that this was real. And then it all began to come to me that, Bram Stoker's work, relative of mine, this guy's made impact, and now I'm reading the story, but oh my gosh, this could be real. So that's how I cut my teeth. Famous Vampire Killers, then Salem's Lot, and it still makes me shiver when I think about that.
Let me inject some comment about one of the most effective vampire novels, which was based on a real psychiatric case, by the way, is Some of Your Blood, that Theodore Sturgeon wrote. And if you don't know it, correct that. You will be amazed.
Okay, say it again. What's the name?
It's called Some of Your Blood.
Okay.
And Theodore Sturgeon was the author. It's not a very long novel, and it really is based on an actual psychiatric case.
Wow, thank you.
You're welcome.
Matthew, what was your first exposure to vampires?
This is gonna seem a little silly, but I mean it's entirely true. Is the Count on Sesame Street?
Oh my God, for the same person I was gonna say.
No, that he was always my favorite, and being an adult and realizing like what they did with that, because one of the things with vampires is their obsessive compulsiveness, and one of the ways you stop them is you spread out grains of sand or rice or grain or whatever across your threshold, and they have to stop and they have to count each grain before they can come in. And then it's the Count who has to count things, and realizing just the genius of that, as an adult is just funny. But I mean, just in addition to that, I think I remember I saw the Bela Lugosi Dracula, I think probably when I was 6 or 7, I think. It was like, because it was back in the early 80s, and they were doing this thing where they were showing like 3D movies on TV with the red and the blue with the glasses, and there was like Creature from the Black Lagoon was one of them, and Dracula, the Bela Lugosi Dracula, was another one where they did it 3D, and the problem with that is you can see the strings on the rubber bats when they do it in 3D. But that was my first exposure to that movie, I think, and just the creepiness of it, and that's one of the things that's always attracted me to the original novel is I like horror, but I don't like gory horror. I don't like bloody horror. I like creepy horror.
Yeah.
So the novel, the Dracula the novel is is gothic horror. I mean, that's the definition of gothic horror, and so that's what I've always attracted. So that movie, just seeing the sort of the creepy atmosphere of it, is something that stuck with me, I guess, and I wanted to kind of see if I could, when I started wanting to write, was something I wanted to see if I could reproduce.
Marie?
Matthew and I are the same person right now. Definitely the Count. Absolutely the Count. While Oscar was my favorite, The Count, it was definitely impactful. And I think I might have been introduced to Bela Lugosi's Dracula really early on, about 6 or 7 as well. I remember that series you're talking about. I think The Mummy was in it as well. So, I remember that. But I know that, I don't think that was what impacted me, nor do I think Blackula did. I think that when I was, or at least put it this way, there were seeds in the back of my head. But I remember reading Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu early. I might have been 13, maybe 12, 13. And I remember reading it and thinking, well, now I haven't seen that on television before. That's not one of the, I've never seen that depicted. Wow. So when I still didn't write the story. And then I saw the Gary Oldman, the Bram Stoker movie with Gary Oldman in it. Which one was that? 96? Was that 96? Maybe. And I just kept thinking, okay, look, I've been dancing around vampires forever. Now I saw this movie that's fantastic. I'm going to write this story. And the story that my very first story ended up being something that was, a mix of the fear, but the appeal. And I think it's because of that combination of influences.
Well, we're actually coming up on time. So before we wind up, is there anything that anybody else would like to mention that we haven't talked about? I know there's a world of things we haven't talked about in an hour, but is there anything else you would like to add to today's discussion?
Well, let me just quickly say, as you guys were talking about some of these early influences, that's a great question, Nancy. I've got to say, contemporary stuff, because I've looked into some of this stuff. Do you realize there was an episode of The Office that had the Bat and Talk of Transylvania in it? The movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall, had that opera with the vampire in it. And you go further back, Brady Bunch, F Troop, obviously the remakes of Addams Family, The Munsters. So, we've all started, early with this, but it's still going. And people today are being introduced and they're cutting their teeth on some of this good, wholesome television. And then they can start reading our books after that. So, Nancy, I got to tell you, that's a great question, but it just doesn't go away. It just gets reinvented in better and better ways, doesn't it?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Anybody else want to add anything before we wind up?
Well, I'd like to add one thing about, you were talking about, you don't like bloody horror. Bloody horror is not bloody, it's not horror, it's terror. The Greeks, in their wisdom, had these two words. One of them is horror, one of them is terror. Terror is fear of the known. Horror is fear of the unknown. And so the real trick in good horror writing is to keep the unknown going for as long as you possibly can.
Well, on that note, let's go. Oh, yeah, sure.
I think we definitely have to say one more time that vampires are cool.
Okay.
Brava.
Right. Anybody else want to add to the coolness factor? No? Okay, well then let's go around, and if each of you will tell people where they can find information about you and your work, and if there's anything in particular you're working on or have coming out that you'd like to mention, that would be great. And Quinn, we'll start with you.
I'm just finishing up the 5th Chesterton Holt Gentleman Haunt mystery, and then I will be going to work on the 34th Saint-Germain book, which is set in the 1630s in the Caribbean. Then after that, one other thing I must mention this. Coming out in the next couple months is the first audiobook of a Saint-Germain thing, and it's Hotel Transylvania.
Matthew?
So my website is jamessaunders.com. That's where all of my stuff is. My blog, everything else, where you can find me everywhere. I'm working on shifted from vampires to werewolves currently, is what I'm working on now. If you go back to, some of the folklore, there's a lot of overlap there. That's my current work, sort of a Southern Gothic take on on the werewolf myth. But you know, I can't say I'm, you know, left the vampires behind completely.
Marie?
You can find me at elmariewood.com. That also has all of my books and my current works. I just added a coming soon section. I'm kind of proud of that. But I am finishing up a piece that actually I'm not going to talk mum's the word about, but the second novel of my Realm series is actually coming out in October. I also have moved on from vampires to ghosts and the supernatural right now, but I can never leave vampires alone for long. So I'm certain I'll be back to them soon.
And Dacre?
Next year is the 125th anniversary of Dracula being published, so I've got a lot of cool things in the works. So working with a fellow named Chris Macaulay on adapting some of Bram Stoker's earlier short stories into graphic novels. We've done one of them already, and another one is going to be coming out in October, as is with Scar Comics, actually Complete Dracula, which is things that were edited out of the story. And we're also working on a full range of video games, RPG games, tabletop games, and I'm also planning tours to take people to Transylvania, to Whitby, and to Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram actually wrote the novel. So big year coming up next year for Stoker fans, and I'm one of the big ones.
Well, thank you all for joining Continual for this discussion. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who has watched the panel. And you can find me, I forgot to say, at nancynorthcott.com or on Twitter, where I spend more time than is good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott. So with that note, again, thank you to everybody for participating in the panel and to everyone who has watched it, and we appreciate it.